The knock came at 2 in the morning. Glenn Harper opened the door to find Candace Morgan standing in the rain, mascara streaking down her cheeks like black rivers, her whole body trembling. 3 weeks since her husband's funeral. 3 weeks of silence between their shared wall. 3 weeks of Glenn hearing her cry alone in the dark, doing nothing. Now she stood on his doorstep, soaked through her thin robe, eyes swollen and desperate. "Can you stay tonight?" Her voice cracked on the last word. "I can't be alone anymore." Glenn knew what the neighbors would say. He knew what it looked like a widow asking a single dad to stay the night. But he also knew that kind of silence, that suffocating emptiness that fills a house after death, takes someone you love. What he didn't know was that saying yes to one night would unravel something neither of them was prepared for. Glenn Harper had lived in the same duplex for 6 years, long enough to memorize every creak in the floorboards, every draft that slipped through the poorly sealed windows, every sound that traveled through the thin walls separating his home from the one next door. He knew which board groaned at 3 in the morning when he got up to check on his daughter, knew the particular rattle of the pipes when winter came too fast and the heating struggled to keep up. The place wasn't much to look at: peeling paint on the porch, railing, a lawn that always seemed 1 week past, needing a trim, but it was theirs. His and Rosie's. A small kingdom built on routines and quiet mornings, and the smell of coffee brewing before sunrise. Every day started the same way. The alarm buzzed at 5:45, and Glenn would lie there for exactly 3 minutes, staring at the ceiling, gathering himself, before swinging his legs over the side of the bed. By 6, the coffee pot was gurgling its familiar song, and by 6:15, he was cracking eggs into a pan, listening for the sound of small feet padding down the hallway. Rosie always appeared right on schedule, her hair a tangled mess, her eyes still heavy with sleep, dragging her stuffed rabbit by one worn ear. She would climb onto her chair at the kitchen table without a word, and Glenn would set a plate in front of her scrambled eggs toast, with the crusts cut off a glass of orange juice. They rarely spoke during breakfast. They didn't need to. The silence between them was comfortable, worn smooth by years of repetition. Rosie was 8 now, though some days she seemed older, carrying a quiet seriousness that Glenn recognized as his own. She had her mother's eyes, dark and thoughtful, always watching, always taking things in. Marianne had been like that too, before the cancer took her. 4 years ago now, though. Sometimes it felt like yesterday, and other times it felt like a lifetime. Glenn had learned to live around the absence to build his days in such a way that the empty spaces didn't swallow him whole. Work helped. He was a carpenter, self-employed, which meant long hours in his workshop behind the house, the smell of sawdust and wood stain filling his lungs. His hands always busy with something tangible, something real. There was comfort in building things, in taking raw materials and shaping them into something useful. The Morgans had moved in 2 years ago, right around the time Glenn had finally stopped expecting to hear Marianne's voice when he came home. Derek Morgan was the kind of man who waved from his driveway, who borrowed tools and returned them the next day with a 6-pack of beer as thanks, who spent Sunday afternoons throwing a football with his son in the backyard. His wife Candace was quieter, more reserved, but she had a warm smile that reached her eyes whenever she spoke. Their boy Brody was a year younger than Rosie, a bundle of energy, who was always kicking a soccer ball against the fence or chasing the neighborhood cat through the bushes. Glenn had liked them immediately, in the distant way you like neighbors who don't cause problems and occasionally bring over cookies during the holidays. Then 3 weeks ago, everything changed. Glenn had been in his workshop when he heard the sirens had stepped outside to see the ambulance pulling away from the Morgans' driveway. Lights flashing, but no siren, a detail that told him everything he needed to know. Derek Morgan had collapsed at work, a heart attack that came without warning and left without mercy. He was 41 years old, the same age Glenn had been when Marianne died. The funeral was small and quick, the way funerals always seem to be when death comes too soon. Glenn had attended, with Rosie had stood in the back row of the church and watched Candace clutch her son's hand, her face pale and frozen, her eyes fixed on the casket, like she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. After that, the silence from the other side of the wall changed. It became heavier, more oppressive, punctuated by sounds that made Glenn's chest tight with recognition. He heard her crying at night, soft sobs that leaked through the thin plaster like water through cracks. He noticed the trash cans that didn't get wheeled to the curb on collection day, the lawn that grew longer each week, the car that sat in the driveway without moving. He wanted to help, felt the urge to knock on her door and offer something Casserole's yard work company, but he didn't know how. The space between wanting to help and actually helping felt impossibly wide, filled with all the things that could go wrong, all the ways his gesture might be misunderstood. So he did nothing. He watched from his kitchen window as the weeks passed, as the signs of grief accumulated like unpaid bills, and he told himself it wasn't his place to interfere. Candace had friends, surely. Family. People who knew her better than a neighbor, who had only ever exchanged pleasantries over the fence. He convinced himself that someone else would step in, that he was not the right person for this particular job. But every night, when the crying started, he lay awake and wondered if he was making a terrible mistake. The night she came to his door started like any other. Rosie had gone to bed at 8:30 after their usual routine of brushing teeth, reading a chapter from whatever book they were working through, and one last trip to the bathroom. Glenn had settled onto the couch with a beer, and the television turned low, not really watching, just letting the noise fill the quiet. Outside rain had started to fall, a steady drumming against the windows that usually would have lulled him toward sleep. Instead, he found himself staring at the wall that separated his living room from Candace's, listening for the sounds that had become as familiar as his own heartbeat. The knock was so soft, he almost missed it, almost wrote it off as a trick of the rain or a branch scraping against the siding. But then it came again, 3 gentle taps that cut through the white noise of the storm, and Glenn felt his stomach drop. He crossed the room slowly, suddenly aware of his own heartbeat, of the way his hand trembled slightly as he reached for the doorknob. When he opened the door, the sight of Candace Morgan nearly knocked the breath from his lungs. She stood on his porch in a thin cotton robe, the fabric soaked through and clinging to her frame, her bare feet pale against the wet wood. Her hair hung in dark ropes around her face, and when she looked up at him, her eyes were red-rimmed and swollen, the kind of raw that comes from crying until there's nothing left. Mascara ran down her cheeks in dark streaks, mingling with the rain, and her whole body shook from cold or grief or both. Glenn couldn't tell. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The rain pounded the porch roof, and somewhere in the distance, thunder rolled like a warning. "Can you stay tonight?" Her voice was barely a whisper, rough and broken at the edges. "I can't be alone anymore." Glenn felt the words land somewhere deep in his chest, felt them stir memories he had spent years trying to keep buried. He thought of Marianne's final months, the way the house had felt too big and too empty after she was gone. The nights he had lain awake, praying for someone, anyone to simply exist in the same space as him. He thought of Rosie, asleep down the hall, and what the neighbors might think if they saw him crossing into Candace's house at this hour. He thought of all the reasons to say no, to politely decline to offer some other form of help that didn't involve stepping across a threshold that felt suddenly fraught with meaning. But when he looked at Candace, at the desperation in her eyes, at the way her hands clutched the collar of her robe, like it was the only thing keeping her from falling apart, he couldn't find a single word of refusal. He had been where she was standing. He knew exactly what that darkness felt like, how it pressed in from all sides, until you couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't do anything but drown. The memory of those nights washed over him fresh and sharp, and he knew with sudden clarity that he could not leave her to face them alone. "Let me check on Rosie," he said quietly. "Then I'll come over." Candace's face crumpled with relief, and for a moment, Glenn thought she might collapse right there on his porch. Instead, she nodded a quick, jerky motion and turned back toward her own door without another word. Glenn watched her go, watched the way she hugged herself against the rain, and felt something shift in his chest. A door opening onto a room he had kept locked for a very long time. He found Rosie exactly where he had left her, curled on her side, with the covers pulled up to her chin, her stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. He stood in the doorway for a moment, just watching her breathe, this small person who had somehow kept him tethered to the world when everything else was spinning away. Then he crossed to her bed and kissed her forehead, tasting the faint sweetness of her shampoo, and whispered that he would be right next door if she needed him. She didn't stir. He left a note on the kitchen table just in case, and grabbed the spare key from its hook by the door. The walk to Candace's front door felt longer than the few steps it actually was. Rain soaked through his shirt in seconds, plastered his hair to his forehead, ran down his face like tears. When he knocked, she answered immediately, as if she had been standing just on the other side, waiting. The inside of her house was dark, except for a single lamp in the corner of the living room, casting long shadows across walls that were decorated with family photos. Derek smiling from a dozen different frames, frozen in moments that would never come again. Glenn tried not to look at them as Candace led him to the couch, tried not to think about how strange it was to be here in this space that belonged to another man. They sat at opposite ends of the sofa, a careful distance between them that felt both necessary and absurd. Candace pulled a blanket around her shoulders and stared at the floor, her breath still ragged, her hands still shaking. Glenn didn't say anything. He understood that words weren't what she needed, that sometimes the only thing that helps is the simple presence of another human being, proof that you're not the last person left on Earth. So he sat there in the dim light and listened to the rain and waited for her breathing to slow. At some point, Glenn couldn't have said when Candace fell asleep. One moment, she was sitting upright, tense and trembling, and the next, she had slipped sideways against the arm of the couch, her eyes closed, her face finally peaceful. Glenn watched her for a long time, studied the lines that grief had carved around her eyes and mouth, the way her chest rose and fell with each breath. She looked younger in sleep, more vulnerable, and he felt a fierce protectiveness rise up in him that surprised him with its intensity. He stayed until just before dawn, until the first gray light began to seep through the curtains and the rain finally stopped. Then he stood carefully quietly and let himself out without waking her. The morning air was cool and clean, washed fresh by the storm, and Glenn stood on his own porch for a moment, breathing it in, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Nothing had happened, really. He had sat on a couch, he had been present, and yet he knew in some deep and wordless way that everything had changed. Rosie was still asleep when he slipped back inside the note on the kitchen table untouched. Glenn made coffee and scrambled eggs and pretended it was just another morning, even though his thoughts kept drifting back to the woman on the other side of the wall, to the question she had asked, and the answer he had given. When Rosie appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair tangled and eyes sleepy, he smiled and set her plate in front of her, and tried not to think about what came next. The days that followed settled into a new kind of rhythm, one that Glenn hadn't anticipated, but couldn't seem to resist. It started small, the way these things always do, a leaky faucet that Candace mentioned in passing a lawn that Glenn mowed while he was already mowing his own. He told himself it was nothing, just neighborly kindness, the sort of thing anyone would do. But the tasks kept multiplying, and he kept finding reasons to be there, and before long, he was spending more time in Candace's orbit than he spent in his own. He fixed the loose board on her back porch. He replaced the batteries in her smoke detectors. He dragged her trash cans to the curb on collection day and returned them to the garage when the truck had passed. Each task felt necessary, felt like the least he could do, and each one brought him a little closer to a line he wasn't sure he should be crossing. Candace never asked for his help, not directly, but she didn't refuse it either. She would stand in the doorway and watch him work her arms crossed over her chest, her expression unreadable. And when he finished, she would thank him in a voice that was soft and sincere, and somehow devastating. The children made it easier, gave them both a reason to be in each other's lives that had nothing to do with the strange tension building between them. Rosie and Brody had started playing together after school, chasing each other through the backyards, building forts out of cardboard boxes and fallen branches, their laughter rising like music over the fence. Glenn would stand at his kitchen window and watch them, and sometimes Candace would appear at hers, and they would catch each other's eyes and smile, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. Dinners became a habit. Candace would cook nothing fancy, just simple meals that she said helped keep her hands busy, and Glenn and Rosie would come over, and the four of them would sit around the table like a family that had always existed. Brody talked, constantly filling every silence with stories about school and soccer and the lizard he had found in the garage. Rosie listened with the patient attention she brought to everything, occasionally offering a quiet observation that made the adults laugh. And Glenn and Candace would glance at each other over the children's heads, and something would pass between them that neither dared to name. Glenn began to notice things about her that he hadn't before, small details that lodged themselves in his mind and refused to leave. The way she tucked her hair behind her ear when she was nervous. The way her eyes crinkled at the corners when she laughed, which was rare, but becoming less so. The way she moved through her kitchen with a grace that seemed unconscious, reaching for things without looking her hands, knowing exactly where everything belonged. He noticed the curve of her neck, the shape of her hands, the way she bit her lower lip when she was thinking. He noticed, and he tried not to notice, and he failed. She called him at night sometimes. Not every night, but often enough that he began to expect. It began to lie awake, listening for the phone. Her voice would come through the line, small and uncertain, asking if he could come over just for a little while, just until she felt steady again. And every time he would check on Rosie and cross the dark space between their doors and sit with her in that dim living room, not touching, barely speaking, just being there. The guilt came later, in the quiet moments, when he was alone with his thoughts whispering that he was taking advantage of her vulnerability, that she wasn't ready for whatever this was becoming, that he should step back before someone got hurt. The neighbors noticed. Of course they did. Glenn could see it in the way Mrs. Patterson across the street watched him leave Candace's house in the early mornings, in the way the women at the grocery store stopped talking when he walked past. He heard the whispers, or imagined he did, about the widow who couldn't wait, about the single dad who should know better. The words stung more than he wanted to admit, not because they weren't true, but because they might be. He didn't know his own intentions anymore, couldn't separate the desire to help from the desire for something else entirely. Candace felt it too. He could see the guilt in her eyes, the way she sometimes flinched when Derek's name came up in conversation, the way she stopped in front of their wedding photo and stared at it like she was waiting for permission or forgiveness or both. One evening after the children had gone to bed and they were sitting on her back porch with cups of tea growing cold between them, she turned to him with tears streaming down her face and said she didn't know what she was doing, didn't know who she was becoming, didn't know how to want something and hate herself for wanting it at the same time. Glenn reached for her hand without thinking, and she let him take it, and they sat there in the darkness while the summer insects sang around them, their fingers intertwined, their hearts racing with fear and possibility. He wanted to tell her it was okay, that they hadn't done anything wrong, that grief and loneliness and connection weren't sins to be confessed, but the words wouldn't come because he wasn't sure he believed them himself. So instead, he just held her hand and stared at the stars and wondered how two broken people could possibly fix each other. The distance crept in gradually, the way it always does when guilt becomes too heavy to carry. Glenn started finding reasons not to come over small excuses that Candace accepted with a nod that told him she understood, that she was perhaps relieved. The dinners became less frequent, then stopped altogether. The children still played, but the adults kept to their separate yards, waving from a distance, maintaining the careful boundary that had somehow reassembled itself between them. Rosie asked once why Mrs. Morgan didn't come around anymore, and Glenn didn't know what to say. So he said nothing, and his daughter's silence afterward was worse than any question she could have asked. Glenn told himself it was better this way. Candace needed time to grieve properly without the complication of whatever had been growing between them. He needed to focus on Rosie, on his work, on the life he had built before the knock on his door in the rain. But the arguments felt hollow, even inside his own head. And at night, when he lay awake, listening for sounds from the other side of the wall, the silence felt like an accusation he couldn't answer. 2 months after Derek's funeral, Candace found the box. Glenn learned about it later, pieced together the story from the fragments she shared, but he could picture it clearly. Candace kneeling on the floor of the bedroom closet, surrounded by Derek's clothes and shoes and the accumulated debris of a life, cut short, her hands closing around a wooden box she had never seen before. Inside was a letter, handwritten on plain white paper, the ink slightly smudged, as if the writer's hand had been unsteady. Derek had known. The doctors had told him about his heart condition. Months before the attack had given him warnings. He chose to ignore statistics he decided not to share with his wife. The letter was his attempt at goodbye, at explanation, at something approaching closure. He wrote about his love for Candace, for Brody, for the life they had built together. He wrote about his regrets, the trips they never took, the conversations they never finished. And he wrote about the future, the one he wouldn't be part of. There was a section near the end that made Candace's hands shake so badly she had to set the letter down. Derek had written about Glenn, about the neighbor who fixed things and kept to himself, and was raising a daughter alone the same way Candace would soon be raising their son. He had noticed apparently the small kindnesses Glenn offered, the quiet way he moved through the world. And in his final letter, Derek had asked something that Candace couldn't quite believe she was reading. If something happens to me, don't close yourself off. Don't let grief become your whole life. And if Glenn Harper ever offers you his hand, take it. He's a good man. He'll understand what you've lost, because he's lost it too. You deserve to be happy again, Candy. Promise me you won't forget that. Candace brought the letter to Glenn's door on a Tuesday evening, her eyes red, but her hand steady, something new in her expression that he couldn't quite identify. She handed it to him without a word, and he read it standing in his doorway while the sun set orange and pink behind the houses across the street. And when he finished, he didn't trust himself to speak. Derek Morgan, a man he had barely known, had seen something Glenn himself had been too afraid to name, had given them permission from beyond the grave, as if permission were something that could be granted, as if it were that simple. I don't know what to do with this, Candace said, her voice barely above a whisper, I don't know what it means. Glenn looked up from the letter, looked at this woman who had been through hell and was somehow still standing, and felt something break open inside his chest. It means he loved you, he said slowly. It means he wanted you to be okay. Is that all it means? The question hung between them, heavy with everything they had been refusing to say. Glenn thought about Marianne, about the promise he had made at her bedside, to live his life, really live it even after she was gone. He thought about Rosie, who deserved a father who wasn't hiding from his own heart. He thought about all the reasons this was complicated, messy, potentially disastrous. And then he thought about the alternative, about going back to the silence and the solitude, and the careful distance that had been slowly killing him. "I've been falling for you," he said, and the words felt like stepping off a cliff, terrifying and inevitable. "And I've been hating myself for it." Candace's breath caught, and for a long moment she just stared at him, her eyes bright with tears that hadn't yet fallen. "I know," she said, finally. "Me too." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of everything they had been holding back, all the fear and hope and uncertainty that had been building for weeks. They stood there on Glenn's porch as the sky darkened, as the first stars appeared, as the neighborhood settled into its evening rhythms around them. Neither of them moved to close the distance, but neither of them looked away either. It felt like the beginning of something, or the end of something, or maybe both at once. A sound from inside the house broke the spell, Rosie and Brody tumbling through the back door, their voices raised in the universal argument of children who have been playing too long and are overtired and hungry. Glenn and Candace both turned toward the noise, and when they looked back at each other, something had shifted. The confession was out in the open now, acknowledged, if not resolved, and there was no way to unspeak it. "We should talk," Candace said. "Really talk. About what this is about, where it goes." Glenn nodded. "Not tonight. But soon." "Soon," she agreed. She took the letter back from his hands, folded it carefully, and walked across the dark lawn to her own door. Glenn watched her go, watched the light come on in her kitchen, watched her silhouette move past the window. Then he went inside to feed the children and put them to bed, and lie awake for hours thinking about what had just happened and what might happen next. The conversation, when it finally came, happened on Candace's back porch late at night, after both children were asleep. They sat in the old wooden chairs that Derek had built years ago, the ones that creaked when you shifted your weight, and they talked about the things that scared them. Candace spoke about the guilt about feeling like she was betraying Derek's memory by wanting someone else, even though he had explicitly told her not to feel that way. Glenn spoke about his fear of ruining what they had, of rushing into something that would only hurt them both, of what it would mean for Rosie if things went wrong. They agreed to take it slow. No labels, no expectations, no pressure. Just two people who had found something unexpected in the middle of their grief, trying to figure out how to hold it without breaking it. They would keep being neighbors, keep sharing dinners and fixing faucets and letting their children play together. But they would also stop pretending that was all they were. Stop hiding from the thing that had been growing between them since the night Candace knocked on Glenn's door in the rain. The weeks that followed were strange and wonderful and terrifying all at once. Glenn found himself smiling at odd moments, humming while he worked in his shop, feeling lighter than he had in years. Candace started laughing. More, started wearing colors other than black, started planning things for the future, instead of just surviving each day as it came. The children noticed, of course, children always do, but they seemed to accept the new arrangement with the easy flexibility of youth, more interested in their own games than in the complicated dance their parents were doing. One night, Candace called Glenn over not because she was afraid, but because she wanted him there. They sat on her porch and drank tea and talked about nothing in particular, and at some point she rested her head on his shoulder and he put his arm around her, and they stayed like that until the stars wheeled overhead and the temperature dropped and they finally had to go inside. It was the first time they had touched since that night on his porch, and it felt like coming home to a place Glenn hadn't known he was missing. She told him about Derek, really told him, not just the surface facts, but the deep stuff, the silly arguments and private jokes, the way he snored, and the way he danced, the 1,000 small things that made up a marriage. Glenn listened without jealousy, understanding that loving someone new didn't mean forgetting someone old, that the heart was bigger and stranger than anyone gave it credit for. And then when she was finished, he told her about Marianne, About the diagnosis, the treatment, the long, slow decline. About the night she died, and the morning he had to tell Rosie. About the years of learning to live again one day at a time, one small victory at a time. They were healing each other, Glenn realized. Not fixing, you couldn't fix grief, couldn't make it disappear, but healing the slow, patient work of knitting together what had been torn apart. Every conversation was a stitch, every shared meal, every quiet evening on the porch. They were building something new out of the wreckage of what they had lost, and for the first time in a very long time, Glenn allowed himself to believe it might actually work. Spring arrived slowly that year, creeping in with longer days and warmer nights, and the first tentative buds on the trees. Glenn was working on the fence between their yards one Saturday afternoon, replacing boards that had rotted over the winter, when Candace came out with a glass of lemonade and a look on her face that he couldn't quite read. The children were playing in her backyard, their voices rising and falling in the complicated negotiations of make-believe. "You know," she said, handing him the glass, "you don't have to fix that." Glenn paused, hammer in hand, and looked at the gap in the fence. It was wide enough to step through without climbing, had been for months now, and he realized suddenly that neither of them had ever mentioned it. It was just there, this opening between their worlds, as natural as breathing. "I kind of like it broken," Candace continued, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "It makes it easier to come and go." Glenn set down the hammer and took a long drink of lemonade, tasting the tart sweetness on his tongue, feeling the sun warm on the back of his neck. He looked at the gap in the fence, at the woman standing beside him, at the two children chasing each other through the grass. And he thought about walls, about the ones we build, and the ones we tear down, about the spaces we create between ourselves and the people we love. "Maybe I'll just make a gate instead," he said. Candace's smile widened, and it was the first time Glenn had seen it reach all the way to her eyes since before Derek died. Not just a polite smile, not just a grateful one, but a real smile full of hope and warmth and something that looked very much like joy. She didn't say anything, but she didn't need to. She just stood there beside him in the spring sunshine, close enough that their shoulders almost touched, and watched their children play in the yard that was no longer divided. Glenn thought about the future, about where this was going, about all the questions they hadn't yet answered. He didn't know what came next, didn't know if they would stay neighbors or become something more, didn't know how to blend their broken families into something whole, didn't know how to navigate the complicated terrain of love after loss. But for the first time in years, he wanted to find out. He wanted to see what was on the other side of the fear, what kind of life might be waiting if he was brave enough to reach for it. He picked up the hammer again, but instead of replacing the broken board, he began measuring for hinges. A gate, he thought. Not a wall, not a gap, but a gate. Something that could open and close. Something that acknowledged the boundary while making it permeable. Something that said, "I see you over there, and I want to come through." Candace watched him work her lemonade glass held loosely in both hands, her expression soft and unguarded in a way he had rarely seen. The children's laughter rose around them like birdsong, and somewhere in the distance, a lawnmower hummed its summer song. It was an ordinary afternoon in an ordinary neighborhood full of ordinary sounds and smells, and Glenn realized that was exactly what he wanted. Not grand gestures or dramatic revelations, but this quiet moments in the sunshine, building something small and useful, watching his daughter play with a boy who might become her brother. The gate would take time to finish. Everything worth building did. But as Glenn measured and cut and fit the pieces together, he felt a lightness spreading through his chest, a loosening of something that had been clenched tight for far too long. He didn't know what tomorrow would bring. He didn't know if he and Candace would end up together or apart, didn't know how the neighbors would react or what the children would think, or whether he was making the biggest mistake of his life. But right now, standing in the spring sunshine with sawdust on his hands, and the woman he was falling in love with beside him, none of that mattered. Right now, he was building a gate in a broken fence, and it felt like exactly the right thing to do. He looked up from his work and caught Candace's eye, and she smiled at him, and he smiled back, and the moment stretched between them like a promise. Not a promise of forever, not a guarantee of happiness, but something smaller and more precious, a promise to try. To show up. To keep building one board at a time, one day at a time, until they had made something strong enough to hold them both. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, and the children had finally worn themselves out and were lying in the grass staring at the clouds. Glenn set down his tools and stood beside Candace close enough now that their shoulders did touch, and together they watched the day end. "It's gonna be okay," Candace said quietly, and Glenn couldn't tell if she was asking him, or telling him, or trying to convince herself. "I think so too," he said, and standing there in the fading light with the half-built gate between them and the whole uncertain future ahead, Glenn Harper realized that he meant it. Whatever came next, whatever challenges they faced, whatever mistakes they made along the way, they would face it together. Not as neighbors, not as friends, but as two people who had found each other in the darkness and decided to walk toward the light. The gate could wait until tomorrow. For now, it was enough to stand here in the golden evening shoulder to shoulder and believe that better days were coming.